The epic battles of the Eastern and Western fronts, as well as the war in the Pacific, often are central to the depictions of World War II. But the conflict was truly global, and each of its smaller parts was crucial and decisive. The invasion of Greece by Italy and then Germany is among such lesser talked about parts of the war. Welcome to our documentary on the Battle of Greece and the Battle of Crete. These long videos take forever to make, so we would appreciate all the likes and shares we can get. It helps immensely. If you're interested in the history of this era, don't forget to check out our second channel, The Cold War. The link is in the top right corner. Shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Mindstone. Mindstone is a fresh take on the learning process, a tool designed to help you process information quickly and efficiently, ultimately helping you learn faster and remember more. It's an excellent platform for productivity and learning, whether you like learning alone or with a team. Mindstone is a great find for our channel. We always collaborate as a team to share ideas and research our scripts, and Mindstone is perfect for that, allowing us to create notes, annotate articles, comment and view your peers' comments on reference material. You can highlight any text across various articles and then view the summary in the highlight view, allowing you to quickly see all key material instantly. There's also a remember feature that creates flashcards and helps you remember all the key facts with a spaced repetition algorithm, which is the best way to learn to ensure you remember more. If you come across something you want to remember, you can tell Mindstone by clicking on a highlight and setting yourself a question like a flashcard. Mindstone has entered our research process and it's here to stay. The best thing, if you sign up for Mindstone before June 30th, you'll become a free founding user for life. We used Mindstone to put together the reference material for this video. Click on the link below to join our shared library and join the conversation with us directly. Support our channel and this great new platform by joining Mindstone today. The wake of the 20th century saw Italian nationalists pressing for the expansion of their empire. The recently unified Kingdom of Italy was striving to form a powerful colonial empire, with Italian Somaliland and Eritrea among the first colonies to be established overseas. During the Italo-Ottoman War of 1911, Italy occupied the largely Greek Dodecanese islands and annexed the province of Libya in northern Africa. For their participation in World War I, they were promised the provinces of Trento, South Tyrol and Dalmatia, the Austrian littoral, parts of western Carniola, and the German colonies in Africa. At the end of the war, they didn't receive all of the land that was promised, causing the Italian government to be humiliated. This mutilated victory, as it was called by Italian nationalists, led to the rise of fascism in the kingdom, with their leader, Benito Mussolini, becoming prime minister in 1922. Mussolini desired to forge a new Roman Empire in Africa and the Balkans, and wanted to achieve supremacy over the Mediterranean, where their sphere of influence was based. At the same time, a defeat against burgeoning Turkey in 1922 had thrown Greece into a chaotic state, in which the monarchy was overthrown, and several revolutions and counter-revolutions ensued. In 1935, the Royalists, with the help of the British, restored King George II to the Greek throne, but the country was still in a period of crisis. The king, instead of attempting to solve the crisis through parliamentary means, called on Ioannis Metaxas, a former army general with pro-fascist ideas, to form a new cabinet. On August 4, 1936, the new Metaxas regime abolished the constitution and the political parties and set up a dictatorship. Metaxas, now the prime minister in this fascist government, sought to establish order back to his country, although this didn't bend the democratic spirit of the Greek people. As the outbreak of war was looming over Europe, Metaxas followed a policy of neutrality and close relationships with the other Mediterranean powers. Italian-Greek relations had never been particularly good, but relations worsened after the Italian invasion of Albania, which gave them a foothold in the Balkans. The presence of Mussolini's troops at the Greco-Albanian border threw the Greeks into the arms of the British, to whom they were also economically dependent. This resulted in the acceptance of a British guarantee of independence on April 13th. The start of World War II, however, reversed Italian plans for a Greek invasion, as in 1940 they were fighting the British in northern Africa as well as in the Mediterranean, and couldn't open another front. But Count Galeazzo, foreign minister and Mussolini's son-in-law, had other plans. He exercised much control over Albanian governor Francesco Jomini and military commander Sebastiano Visconti Presca, and saw Albania as his own personal domain. Ciano believed that he could increase his popularity in Albania by adding territories with Albanian minorities in Greece and Yugoslavia, coinciding with Mussolini's expansionist desires. Mussolini was finally convinced by the assassination of the Albanian leader in northern Greece, Daud Hoxha, and an invasion was planned for the end of September. Visconti Presca started moving Italian units to the Greek frontier, while Albanian guerrillas were armed and trained to disrupt the Greek rear. But the Germans delayed the start of the operation because they wanted to maintain the status quo in the Balkans. In response, the Italians tried to force Greece into a reaction that would give them a convenient pretext to invade. Provocations reached their peak in August when the submarine Delfino torpedoed and sank the HRN destroyer Eli. The Greek authorities feigned ignorance on the identity of the attackers, but prepared for war. When on the 12th of October 1940, German troops entered Romania, Mussolini decided to act immediately, proclaiming October 26th as the day of the invasion. Although Il Duce was furious because Romania was in the Italian sphere of influence, the German interest in the Balkans prevented Turkey from coming to Greece's aid, and this allowed the dictator to declare war on them. On October 22nd, Ciano drew up an ultimatum to be presented to Metaxas, intended to leave Greece no way out, either occupation or war. Metaxas answered with his famous "όχι," or no. 6 days later, some 140,000 men, under torrential rain, invaded Greece along a 90-mile front. They believed the invasion would be fast and would face around 36,000 Greeks, enjoying a 3-to-1 advantage against the defenders. To the surprise of the Italians, the political divisions in Greece were temporarily silenced in a mood of national unity as the Greeks swiftly mobilized reservists to the front lines. At that point, the Greek army fielded one fully mobilized infantry division in Epirus, the 8th Division, commanded by General Charalampos Katsamitros, while the 9th Division was placed at the Yugoslav border. They had no tanks and were low on machine guns and artillery. Supported by other formations, these divisions would have to hold the Italian advance until reinforcements arrived. Only the forces on the border with Bulgaria were not moved, as the Greeks feared the Bulgarians would invade and assist the Italians in their offensive. The British, honouring their guarantee, reinforced Crete, as it was very important for them strategically, and sent aircraft, supplies, and money to help the Greek cause. Pressed by the Italians in Africa, they weren't able to send land forces. The frontier was divided by the invaders into 3 sectors. The Epirus front, under General Carlo Rossi, ran from the sea to Ioannina, and saw the 25th Chiamoria Army Corps, composed of the 23rd Ferrara Division of Mountain Infantry, the 51st Siena Division, the Centaro Armoured Division, the 6th, 7th and 19th Regiments of Cavalry, and the 3rd Regiment of Grenadiers, backed by heavy artillery and black-shirt militias. The Pindus front in the centre had General Mario Girotti's 3rd Giulia Division of elite Alpini mountain troops, backed by a mountain gun battalion and mountain artillery. The eastern sector ran to the Yugoslavian frontier and encompassed the area bordered by Korça, the Italian centre in Albania, and Florina, the gateway to Lake Prespa in Greece. Here, in less mountainous terrain, was the 26th Karitsa Army Corps under General Gabriele Nasci, comprised of the 19th Venezia, 29th Piedmonte, and 49th Parma divisions, 3 battalions of Albanian troops, the 101st Machine Gun Battalion, heavy artillery, and a regiment of tanks. The initial Italian advance of Visconti Presca was in such strength that it sent the Greek forces on the frontier reeling back. There, the Greeks had organized the 17-mile Alea Kalpeki Kalames line in defense of Ioannina, the capital of Epirus. The center of the line was heavily defended, and the left was held with light forces. As the Pindus Mountains gave them shelter, on the right was only a small Evzonis detachment, Greece's famous kilted mountain troops, under General Konstantinos Davakis. At the coast, there was a small 2-battalion detachment led by Major Nikolaos Lumba. The Greek commander-in-chief, Alexandros Papagos, a hero of the Balkan Wars, was placed in command of the defense of the country, and he gave General Katsimitros complete freedom of action, with the mission to hold off the Italian advance until sufficient forces had been raised for a counter-offensive. Katsimitros had a difficult decision: to hold on to the Elea-Calamus line or to retreat towards the second line of defense at the gate of southern Greece, from Preveza through the river Aliakmonas almost to Salonika. In the end, the Greek general decided to protect Ioannina and Epirus and to take advantage of the easily defendable mountainous terrain there. Visconti Prasca, on the other hand, planned to have Rossi's infantry attack the center of the defensive line, while the Centauro armored division advanced through the narrow valley of the Calamus River, attempting an encircling maneuver against their left wing. This attack would be helped by 2 similar maneuvers aiming to encircle Greek forces on the defensive line, one in the Pindus Mountains towards Metsovo, and the other towards Paramythia south of the Calamus River. Visconti Prasca decided not to make any advance into western Macedonia before the Epirus area could be secured. Despite the bad weather, it was planned that in a few weeks Epirus would be, in Mussolini's words, liquidated. On the first day of the offensive, Rossi sent the Siena division with some Albanian contingents to advance south along the coast towards Paramythia under the command of General Francisco Rivolta, while the Ferrara and Centauro divisions advanced into the Elea-Calamus sector as far as Kalpeki. They advanced 30 miles after 2 days, although the armoured division was hindered by the mountainous mud and was rendered useless for fighting in these conditions. None of these units at first encountered any resistance, as Papagos approved an initial strategic withdrawal behind the Calamus River. On November 2nd, the weather improved and the Italians decided to attack the main defensive line. The Battle of Elea-Calamus started with the Ferrara division assaulting the bulk of Katsimitros' line several times. The harshness of the terrain and the 8th's high morale and fortifications repelled attack after attack despite the Italians' air support. On November 5th, Rivolta enjoyed much more success with the crossing of the Calamus River, slowly advancing southwards and capturing the port of Igoumenitsa the following day. In response, the Lumba detachment had to retreat further south to protect the gateway to southern Greece. The deepest Italian advance came 1 day later when the coastal forces occupied the village of Margariti. By November 8th, however, the Italian offensive in Epirus had stopped. At the Pindus Mountains, another struggle was occurring at the same time. The Julia division decisively defeated Davicus' small detachment by October 29th, and 4 days later got within 12 miles of the vital Metsovo Pass, capturing the city of Konitsa and the villages of Samarina and Vavosa. But the Alpini were slowed down by the foul weather conditions and were forced to stop, calling for reinforcements that never came. Papagos realized the precarious situation on this front and sent reinforcements, including the 1st Division. On November 4th, General Vasileios Phraknos commanded this counteroffensive into the Battle of Pindus. He first occupied Mount Tamburi north of Samarina, then sent his cavalry in an encircling maneuver behind the town. Surrounded, the Julia sustained heavy casualties, but eventually managed to break out of the encirclement and started to retreat, calling for reinforcements. Later that day, Phraknos had managed to reoccupy Samarina and Vavousa, pressing his attack on the depleted Julia and completely defeating the Alpini division. Geraoti was now trapped at the village of Distrato, and the Greeks were preparing for a dual attack aimed at dislodging them from the height of Gomara. On November 5th, the Greeks launched their decisive attack against the Julia. From the east, Greek cavalry was ordered to flank the Alpini positions and capture Gomara, while the 7th Battalion was tasked with capturing the western heights. 4 times the 7th's charge was repelled, but in the afternoon a 5th charge managed to expel the Julia from the heights. At the same time, the Greek cavalry secured a precarious foothold on Gomara, yet Geraoti stubbornly clung to his position and threw every resource he had to stop the Greek advance. Yet on the following day, when the 7th moved to cut the only escape road back to Konitsa, the Italian commander realized he had been defeated. Although he continued to resist the relentless assaults of the Greek cavalry for another day, in the end the exhausted Julia division would have to retreat to Konitsa through the Pindus mountains. Under constant artillery bombardment, the Julia fell back along the Aus River, putting up sporadic resistance during their withdrawal. When they finally reached Konitsa, the Julia division was not a proud elite division anymore, it was a battered and demoralized unit. As such, Visconti Prasca quickly decided to send them some reinforcements. The 47th Bari Division, which was earmarked to participate in an invasion of Corfu that had to be dropped because of the failure at Epirus, hurried to the Pindus front, but it was already too late. As the Italians retreated, the Greeks had problems of their own. The supplies for the Greek army in Pindus were poor or non-existent, and there weren't even roads by which the army could be supplied. Due to this situation, the civilian population heroically volunteered to climb the mountains loaded with ammunition and supplies for the Greek forces, fighting side by side with the army. The supply situation for the Italians was also abysmal, as the limited capacity of the two main ports, Valona and Cherezzo, created a bottleneck for supplies and reinforcements. By November 8th, the retreating Italian forces started a line of defense at Konitsa. In the following 5 days, the Greeks launched a steady offensive and managed to advance into the Albanian-Greek frontier line. A new Greek attack against Konitsa started on November 13th. The Italians made a stubborn defense, but 3 days later they evacuated the city after burning it to the ground. Furthermore, Visconti Prasca blamed the defeat on the poor quality of the Albanian soldiers, based on the fact that an Albanian regiment had been decimated in Epirus. This enraged the Albanian commander Prenk Pavizi, who protested that the Albanian soldiers were not to be used as cannon fodder. Mussolini was dissatisfied and decided to replace Prasca with General Ubaldo Sodu as the supreme commander in Albania. This man started organizing a new defensive line on the entire front, and then commanded Revolta to stop the coastal advance and wait for the coming of new reinforcements from Italy. The Greeks had won a great victory on the Epirus and Pindus fronts, sending the Italians back to their initial positions at the Albanian frontier. Facing more than 5,000 casualties, the Italians' morale was severely weakened. With flocks of reinforcements coming from all over Greece, Papagos started planning a major offensive operation to take the key city of Korcha. He appointed General Ioannis Pitsikas to lead it, and divided his forces into 3 army corps: the 1st Corps on the coast of Epirus, the 2nd Corps in the Pindus sector, and the 3rd Corps in Western Macedonia, with the 9th, 10th and 15th Infantry Divisions, backed with artillery in adequate numbers, and with the 11th and 13th being transported to reinforce the corps. Furthermore, Papagos placed the 3rd, 4th and 5th Infantry Divisions in reserve. Sodu, on the other hand, reinforced his line of defense and reorganized his forces into 2 field armies: the 11th Army at the Epirus front with the forces of the former 25th Corps and the remnants of the Julia's Alpini troops, and General Mario Vercellino's 9th Army in the Korcha sector, formed out of the former 26th Corps, with a reserve composed of the 2nd Tredentina Alpine Division, 50 tanks from the Centauro Division, and the 53rd Arezzo Division. The Bari Division was placed at the strategic border post of Aseka between the northern and southern defensive lines. The balance of power had drastically changed, as the Greeks were now twice the number of the Italian forces. Sodu planned to gain time with his defensive disposition until the arrival of new reinforcements from Italy, with which he could launch a second defensive operation. The arrival of all reinforcements was arranged to be completed by December, but the Greek offensive caught them by surprise before that. Mount Moravus, with the northern Mount Ivan, belongs to the Great Pindus mountain range and forms a barrier covering the city and the plateau of Korcha. There were only 2 ways to the Albanian center. One went north through the valley located between Moravus and Ivan, and the other ran northwest through the valley of Dada. Both of these 2 valleys could be accessed from the Greek city of Florina, but the whole area had been fortified by the 9th Army with semi-permanent fortifications. For this reason, Pittacus divided the Korcha front into two. In the north, the 15th, 9th, and the recently arrived 13th Divisions under General Gorgios Solakoglu's 3rd Corps, and in the south, the K Corps, commanded by General Gorgios Kosmas, with the 10th Division and the 11th in reserve. The plan was for the 15th Division to advance west towards the Sangong Pass between Morovis and Ivan and capture its western exit, while the 9th would attack the center of the Italian defensive line towards Mount Morovis, and the K Corps would penetrate the Italian left and flank the enemy positions atop of Morovis. On November 14th, the Greek forces attacked on the whole front from Lake Prespa to Mount Gramos, directed against the Morovis-Ivan area. The main attack was organized against the mountainous southern part of the area, where the Italians couldn't use their armored forces. Also, the Italians weren't expecting a Greek offensive so suddenly, and thus they were taken by surprise. By afternoon, the 10th Division took possession of the Bataros Heights in Morovis and the villages of Nikolitsa and Vuzigrad, while the 9th advanced towards the western bank of the Develis River. The 15th Division, after a 3.5 hour struggle, was able to break the Italian defensive line and take the Sangong Pass, thus isolating Mount Ivan. 15 miles from Nikolitsa, K Corps occupied the Stavroides Heights on November 15th and fortified their position south of the valley of Dadha. At this point, the Albanians under Pavisi had abandoned the front, infuriated by Italian abuse, but Virgilino sent the Arezzo division to reinforce the line of defense. In response, Papagos reinforced the offensive with the 11th and 13th divisions. On November 17th, the 9th and 13th divisions moved to occupy the valley of Dadha, and the 15th tried to take possession of Mount Ivan. One day later, the Greeks faced a critical moment when the 13th Division had to change the direction of their attack under heavy rain, and this resulted in a state of disorder and confusion that almost sent the division into retreat, compromising both the 9th and 10th's rears. But thanks to the actions of Major Sotirios Motousis, order was re-established and the division continued its advance. In reward, Motousis was granted command of the division. After 2 days of heavy fighting, the Greeks seized the supply lines of the enemy and gradually advanced along the high ridge of Mount Morovis under artillery fire. Having seized the valley of the Dadha and the valley between Morovis and Ivan by November 20th, Solakoglu launched his offensive action over Korcha, while Kosmas was sent to take the key border post at Aseka, where the 9th Army's defensive line ended. Despite air support, the advantage of a terrain favourable for defence, and permanent fortifications, Sodu was not able to stabilise a defensive line on the Korcha plateau. Virgilino's forces would have to retreat from the city of Pogradets because they felt threatened by a Greek pincer movement against Korcha. After a hard-fought fight in which the Bari was forced to retreat, the K Corps took Ursika on November 21st. 1 day later, the 15th Division occupied Mount Ivan, and the 9th entered Korcha without resistance, being cheered by the Greek native population. The Greek forces continued to press Sodu's retreating forces 1 day later. The Italians made a disorderly retreat towards Ochrida and Elbasan, as well as Klesura and Pogradets. There they would mount their new defensive line. The fall of Korcha was a devastating blow to the Italian invasion. They had been beaten back by the Greeks, and were now forced to defend in Albania. The city of Korcha was the center of the Italian campaign in the north, and a key supply point for the invaders, and thus losing it heavily demoralized the Italian army. On the contrary, the Greeks' high morale and national fervor inspired them to advance further and to launch a new offensive, directed to take the important port of Saranda and the mountain passes from the northwest to the northeast of Agira Castro. Soon, General Ubaldo Sodu started creating a new defensive line to hold the Greek offensive until sufficient reinforcements arrived. These were inexperienced troops from North Africa, no match for the battle-hardened Greeks. Papagos had originally divided his forces into 3 army corps for the offensive. The first corps under General Panagiotis Demisticus, the second commanded by General Ioannis Papadopoulos, and the 3rd, led by General Gorgios Salakoglu. The 3rd Corps saw itself victorious at the Battle of Moravia-Sivan, and in result brought the fall of Korcha to fruition, while the 1st was chasing the Italians from Epirus, and alarmingly the 2nd at the Pindus sector was still being organized to join the offensive. Themistocus penetrated the Albanian frontier, aiming to advance towards the town of Tepelena on the Vajousa River. Until the fall of Korcha, the Greek army had been transporting their supplies to the front lines through muddy roads from the cities of Florina and Amendaio. From then on, the transport of supplies would be carried out by motorized vehicles. But these vehicles were numerically inadequate and in a bad state, and so the Greek army needed to take the port of Saranda to shorten the supply route. Thus, a major offensive to the Saranda-Kakavia-Leskaviki line began, and would be carried out by the Lumbers detachment with assistance from elements of the 1st Corps. To let the 8th Division under General Charalambos Katsamitros advance, the Greeks first needed to take the Italian position at Metsani, where the Vajousa River starts. Katsamitros' cavalry divisions were sent to strike at Metsani, while the 8th prepared to advance into the border post of Kakavia. On November 21st, the 8th Cavalry defeated a strong Italian force and took Metsani. The way was open for Katsamitros' advance, and soon the Greeks were at the roads of Kakavia. The Lumbers detachment faced the Italians near Gomenitsa and forced their retreat. By November 22nd, the 1st Corps had pushed into the Albanian frontier in Epirus, recovering all of the lost territory, and the 2nd Corps was finally ready to deploy. The southern defensive Italian line now stretched from the port of Saranda to the village of Leskaviki close to Eseka. It was guarded by the 11th Army under General Carlo Geloso, composed of the depleted veteran Ferrara and Siena divisions, as well as the Centaro motorized division. Sodu reinforced this army with the 5th Posterior Alpine Division and the 37th Modena Division. In the north, General Mario Vercellini's 9th Army had retreated in disorder to the Pogradets-Kamia-Ostrobista line to defend strategically important Elbasan. On top of that, the Balkan winter weakened the Italians, as most of their troops had come from North Africa and weren't accustomed to the cold of the Balkans. From Eseka, General Gorgios Kosmas's K Corps took Leskaviki and was later reorganized into the 5th Corps, with the goal of securing the connection between the 2nd and 3rd Corps. In Epirus, Themistocus now pondered his next moves. To reach Tepelena, he had to use the mountain passes from the northwest to the northeast. But at Kakavia, the exhausted 8th Division was facing heavy resistance from the Ferrara and Modena entrenched in the forests. On November 28th, the 8th was reinforced by the 3rd Division, and soon the Italians retreated from Kakavia. Meanwhile, the coastal forces continued their advance towards Saranda, and in the north, the 9th and 13th Divisions were sent to attack the 48th Taro Division defending Pogradets. The Taro fought valiantly, preventing Salakoglu from making any progress. Stymied in front of Pogradets because of a shortage of anti-armor weaponry, the Greek general tried a flanking movement in the hills to the west of the town. Yet the Italians enjoyed a great defensive position there, thanks to a prevailing mist, which was masking the Italian artillery muzzle flashes. When the 13th charged, they were met with a murderous curtain of fire from an invisible Venezia division. In response, General Motoses, an experienced artilleryman himself, ranged the distance with his eyes alone and snapped out the firing coordinates. The Italian positions were then shelled, and this forced them to surrender the heights around Pogradets. On November 30th, the 13th Division overcame the Italians, while the 17th Division was brought up to relieve it. On December 4th, Pogradets fell to the Greeks, the 3rd key Albanian town to do so. With the capture of Pogradets, the 3rd Corps was relegated to a passive role, while the offensive aimed towards Tepelena continued. This offensive had been delayed by air attacks, and to continue their advance, the Greeks needed the 2nd Corps to take the town of Permet and secure the Drina Valley, from which Italian snipers threatened the 1st Corps' position. In early December, the 2nd Corps began its advance along the Vajousa River, aiming to secure the connection between the 1st and 3rd Corps. They faced the Modena division, with the exhausted remnants of the Julia attached. Sensing the enemy's weakness, Papadopoulos attacked the exposed Julia. The Julia was routed, and Modena had to retreat. Soon, the towns of Permet and Frasia fell to the 2nd Corps' advance. At this point, Mussolini was trying to save face by accusing the Greeks of a deep hatred against the Italians, and that they were offering military bases to the British. Praising the tenacity of these soldiers on the front, he urged the Italian people to have faith that Soddu would save the situation. But in Berlin, Hitler was furious about the Italian failure, and he wrote a highly critical letter to Il Duce, blaming him of tarnishing the reputation of the Axis, both politically and militarily. The Führer was preparing his forces for an invasion of Greece. Throughout December, reinforcements continued to pour in to support the retreating Italians, but they were coming too slowly. Soddu was demoralized and wanted an armistice to end the conflict with the Greeks. This angered Mussolini, who sacked Soddu and replaced him with Ugo Cavallero. Cavallero had carefully studied the situation and decided that it would be best to retreat to the Shkumbin River, a natural barrier that spans the width of Albania from the northern approaches of Pogradets in the east to the Adriatic Sea in the west. Frustratingly for the Italians, Cavallero's order to withdraw and reform at Shkumbin came after a series of valiant rearguard actions that gave the Greeks considerable trouble. Though the Greeks had taken Permet on December 3rd, the Italian line of defense across the Kosura Valley was getting stronger. As the 10th and 11th Divisions braced to try and break the line, further to the west the 1st Corps was making slow progress from Kakavia up the Drina Valley along a hugely extended front of 40 miles. It was easier going along the coast, but the Greek advance was brought almost to a halt by bitter fighting on the road to Agira Castro. Along that road stood Hill 669, a strategic height coveted by the Greeks. Gelosso's 11th Army held fanatically onto Hill 669 in 3 feet snow, repulsing several assaults by the Greek 8th Division. By now, the weather was inflicting far more casualties on both sides than the fighting did. For this reason, Domesticus had placed the extenuated 8th Division in reserve, while the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Divisions would be the new vanguard of the 1st Corps. On December 4th, a break in the weather enabled Hill 669 to be taken by Domesticus's forces. Soldiers of both sides were later found frozen to death. 1 day later, the 3rd Division marched into Delvina, while the 4th Division captured Devikan. On December 6th, the Ljumbes detachment finally occupied the key port of Saranda, and the road to Agira Castro was finally open. The following day, General Leonidas Stereopoulos of the 4th Division began his attack on the outskirts of Agira Castro. With Cavallero's order to retreat to the Shkumbin River, the city had been evacuated by the Italians 1 day earlier. On December 8th, elements of the 4th occupied Agira Castro, and another of the Italian centres in Albania fell. Next on the Greek list was Tepelena. The town stood between heights, and the Italians had been fortifying it for 2 months. Because of incessant blizzards, the first Greek attacks on December 15th failed. At the same time, the 3rd Corps successfully secured the Pogradets area, and the 5th Corps captured the Ostrovica mountain, advancing towards Mount Tomari. On the coast, the Greeks continued their advance towards the town of Himare, which stood in the way of the new objective, the important supply port of Valona. General Gorgias Bakos of the 3rd Division was blocked at Borsh by 3 battalions of grenadiers, some black shirt militias, and the depleted Siena Division. Borsh was an ideal defensive position south of Himare, and the grenadiers made full use of its advantages, fortifying it with light and heavy artillery, mortars and machine guns. It took 3 days of relentless attacks and many casualties for the position to fall into Greek hands. The 3rd Division now advanced northeastwards and surrounded Himare. On December 19th, the northeastern town of Kuts fell to a surprise attack, and 2 days later, the northwestern height of Sipista fell as well. Himare was now surrounded, and the Siena was forced to abandon the town to avoid encirclement. The Greek troops entering the town on December 22nd were welcomed by the locals with enthusiastic celebrations. Despite this success, Metaxas knew that eventually the Italians could regroup and start a counteroffensive. He wanted to halt the offensive and define a clear strategy of defense in the now overextended 155-mile line from Pogradets in the north to Himare in the south. On the other hand, Papagos had no other intention than to keep advancing. On December 28th, Metaxas managed to convince Papagos. The Greek objective was now to consolidate the supply and communications lines, while the Second Corps prepared for an offensive to capture the Kelsura Valley. By this point, the 3rd and 5th Corps were reorganized into the West Macedonia Army Department, including the 9th, 10th, 13th and 17th Divisions. Under General Ioannis Pitzikas, their mission was to hold the Korcha-Pogradets sector up to the Yugoslav frontier. Papadopoulos' Second Corps held the central sector on either side of the Vatusa River, with the 1st, 11th and 15th Divisions, and on the left, comprising the Agira Castro sector as far as the coast, stood Themistokos' 1st Corps with the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Divisions, along with the much-handled 8th Division, and with the 5th and 16th Divisions in reserve. The Greeks bolstered their position with around 280,000 men in total. Conversely, Cavallero concentrated most of his strength in the centre, with Virgilino's 9th Army and Gelosso's 11th Army anchored on Mount Tomari, overlooking the Kelsura Valley and the Tomarica Valley, the obvious Greek routes for an advance on Tirana. Further on the Italian right was General Carlo Rossi's reformed 25th Corps, from the coast to the Tomarica Valley, with 6 divisions in defence of Valona. In total, there were around 100,000 men between the right and the centre, with 60,000 more in reserve. On the left, General Gabriele Naschi's 26th Corps was in front of the West Macedonia Army Department, with around 100,000 more men. With a total of 260,000 men, the Italians had strengthened their position, and finally Cavallero had reached an equilibrium. On January 5th, Cavallero launched a snap attack on the Greek lines on the coast. The 58th Legnano Division would advance along the coast to Himare, while Pusteria, Siena and 7th Lupi di Toscana were to hit the 2nd Corps in the centre. The Legnano made some progress but was quickly immobilized, while in the centre, the 15th Division defeated the Wolves of Tuscany, and the 1st and 11th started a counter-offensive against the Kelsura Valley. In just 5 days, and with the reinforcement of the Cretan 5th Division, the strategic Klesura Pass fell and the Kelsura Valley was secured. By January 25th, the 2nd Corps' mission had been achieved with the occupation of the Trebishina mountain range. 2 days later, Rossi's 25th Corps counterattacked and expelled the Greek forces on the Trebishina mountains. The Cretan 5th managed to hold the Italians and repulsed the attack by January 29th. After a hard-fought struggle, the Cretans captured Trebishina on February 2nd. In the following weeks, this division repulsed several Italian attacks trying to dislodge them from the mountain, even under the deadly frozen weather of Trebishina. By the 17th of February, the Greeks had captured the mountain ranges, but it was a costly victory, particularly for the Cretan division, which suffered 5,000 casualties. Greek morale suffered a heavy blow after the death of Metaxas on January 29th. It was certain that the Germans would attack through Bulgaria, and Papagos decided to reorganize his forces to meet this new threat, transferring many divisions back to the Bulgarian border. The 1st and 2nd Corps were placed under the Epirus Army Department, commanded by General Marcos Drakos, with a total of 9 divisions. Papagos then ordered Drakos to launch a desperate offensive to take Tepelena and the key port of Valona. This offensive failed, and as a result, Papagos replaced Drakos with General Pitzikas, while Solakoglu would be left in command of the West Macedonia Army Department. Pitzikas concentrated most of his forces on the Trebishina mountains and dug entrenchments to provide cover, as he sensed that a renewed Italian offensive would be directed against it. And he was right. The Italians now had 28 divisions, and on March 2nd, Mussolini himself arrived in Tirana to oversee the operation. Il Duce wanted to save face by performing a last offensive with the objective of pushing back the Greeks and allowing the Italians to take Epirus. The Operazione Primavera was then scheduled to be launched on March 9th. The plan was to capture back the Clausura Pass and from there advance towards Leskoviki and Ioannina. The attack would be carried out by General Gastone Gambara's 8th Corps, composed of 8 divisions, and the veteran Centauro and Piemonte in reserve. Pizzicus, on the other hand, made General Bacchus the new commander of the 2nd Corps and placed the 17th in his reserve. The spring offensive started at dawn with a devastating artillery barrage and air bombardment. The Puglia division then advanced to capture the strategic Hills 717 and 731 against General Vasileios Vraknos' 1st Division, while the Pinerolo and Sforzesca divisions were pressing up on Meskarahe Ridge. The Italians were repelled, but the Puglia wouldn't give up. A second charge momentarily secured Hill 717, lost it, and then regained it at about 12 PM. Throughout the day, 6 more attempts on Hill 731 came to naught, except to leave piles of Italians dead in front of the Greek lines. At sunset, the Italians remained in possession of Hill 717, but Vraknos wasn't overly worried as long as Hill 731 remained in the 1st Division's hands. Simultaneous Italian attacks on the left of the line failed against the 11th and 15th Divisions. On the Italian right, there was similar ill luck, with the 8th Division stopping the advance towards Meskarahe. The next day broke with another artillery barrage and the Puglia trying once again to take Hill 731. Gambara saw himself perilously near to taking the hill, but was finally repelled. The 1st still held firm. The Cagliari division came to assist the Puglia, trying to outflank the hill, but Vraknos placed units to protect his flanks, and the Cagliari was repelled as well. The fruitless attacks in the mud and rain continued on March 11th. They followed a predictable pattern. Cavallero seems to have no other ideas than to repeatedly feed his men into the Greek artillery and machine guns. The following day, the exhausted Puglia was replaced by the fresh Bari division, which also suffered heavy losses. By the 6th day of the offensive, the strain was beginning to tell. Some Italian units had to be driven forward, and machine gun detachments were set up in the rear to discourage stragglers. By the 15th of March, no fewer than 17 bloody and fruitless attempts had been made on Hill 731. Gambara urged an immediate suspension of the offensive, but Mussolini wouldn't give up that easily. In the meantime, Bacchus replaced the much battered 1st Division with the 17th. On March 18th, Cavallero ordered the 18th attempt to take Hill 731 to be carried out by the Siena with armoured units from the Centauro. This attack, like the others, ended up in bloody heaps on the lower slopes of the hill. Italian casualties in the space of 10 days had been fearsome, with 12,000 dead to no visible advantage. Hill 731 was strewn with the bodies of Greeks and Italians. On March 22nd, the Italians transmitted a request for a ceasefire around the hill, but Papagos counter-proposed a general truce all along the front. The Italians rejected it, and twice more the Siena charged the hill to no avail. After that, Cavallero finally had to admit defeat, and on March 25th, the operation came to a halt. The heroic and battered 1st Division was sent home for a rest in the reserves, and Papagos rearranged his forces again, threatened by the looming German invasion, but still worried about the Italians. The spring offensive was a failure that weakened Mussolini's domestic and international position. The Greeks celebrated this victory, but they had been exhausted and sustained many casualties, leaving them weakened against a German attack. As World War II progressed, it was clear that Nazi Germany had become the dominant power in Europe. The only remaining nation yet to fall to Adolf Hitler's regime, Great Britain, was being heavily bombarded by the Luftwaffe, their colonial possessions in North Africa attacked by both the Germans and the Italians. Hitler thought that victory was assured, and for some time now he had been considering launching an invasion of the Soviet Union. For that, he would need the full support of his allies, Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. The Balkan War had to end, so the Germans started working on their plan for an invasion of Greece, codenamed Operation Marita. In Greece, however, popular mood was changing. With their leader Metaxas gone, their morale dropped. The collapse of the economy, lack of food and good news from the front, and the increase in dead and wounded didn't help. Germany was the big darkening cloud on the northern horizon. The Greek commander-in-chief, Alexandros Papagos, addressed this situation and planned a joint offensive with the Yugoslavs and the British to crush the Italians before Germany could attack. The Germans feared that the British aircraft based in Greece would bomb the Romanian oil fields, their only source of oil on the Eastern Front. They needed to secure their southern flank if they wanted to be prepared to face the Soviet Union. In March 1941, Hitler pressured Bulgaria and Yugoslavia to sign the Tripartite Pact and join the Axis. Furthermore, the 12th Army was stationed on the Bulgarian frontier for the invasion, with the 5th and 16th Panzer Divisions on the border with Turkey to deter them from intervening. But on March 27th, Hitler's plans were thwarted by a coup d'état in Yugoslavia. The new Yugoslavian regime, assisted by the British, committed to the defense of Greece and assured they would protect the Struma Valley. To defend eastern Macedonia, the Greeks had constructed a chain of fortifications along the Bulgarian border in defense of the key center of Salonika. The 96-mile Metaxas line, named after their deceased leader, consisted of 21 fortification complexes, the largest one being Fort Rupel. This line, however, was poorly manned, as 12 divisions were needed and only 4 were assigned. General Konstantinos Bakopoulos commanded the Eastern Macedonia Army section there, with the 7th and 14th Divisions to the east of the Strymon River, and to the west, the 18th and the newly assembled 19th Mechanized Division under General Nikolaos Lumbas, a veteran of the previous campaign. The rest of Papagos's forces were still on the Albanian front, preparing for a final offensive to push Italy out of the Balkans. On March 2nd, the British sent the W Expeditionary Force under General Sir Henry Wilson. This force was composed of the 1st Armoured Brigade, led by Brigadier Harold Charrington, the 2nd New Zealand Division under General Bernard Freyberg, and the 6th Australian Division, commanded by General Sir Ivan Mackay. By March 21st, Charrington and Freyberg had got their men up to the Alikmon River. This second line extended east of the town of Florina, passing through Edessa all the way to the north of Mount Olympus and the coast of Katerini. Although Papagos didn't want to forsake Salonika, the Greeks supported them with the Central Macedonia Army section, composed of the 12th and 20th Divisions. Not willing to lose an Axis member, Hitler adjusted the plans of Operation Marita to also include the invasion of Yugoslavia. Many forces of the German 12th Army were redirected against the Yugoslavian-Bulgarian border, while the rest of the army would storm the Metaxas line. The plan was to overrun southern Yugoslavia, to outflank the Metaxas line and encircle the Greeks. There was a weak spot on the left of the Metaxas line, Mount Belis, where the borders of Greece, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria met. If breached, the Germans could be in Salonika in hours, cutting off the forces in the east. Furthermore, if the Monastir Pass fell to the Germans, the Greek army in Albania would be trapped and would have to surrender. For this reason, the possession of Monastir and the Axios Valley was essential. The 12th Army of Field Marshal Wilhelm List was divided into 3 army corps, comprising 5 armoured panzer divisions, including 3 SS regiments of the Adolf Hitler Panzer Division under Josef Dietrich, 2 motorized divisions, 3 light mountain divisions, and some infantry divisions, with over 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft and 1,900 heavy tanks, against Wilson's 176 tanks and 45 aircraft. By April 5th, these forces had been successfully assembled. At 5:15 AM on April 6th, the Germans declared war on Greece. At the same time, the invasion of Yugoslavia started with the bombing of Belgrade. List's motorized artillery began their bombardment of Fort Rupel and the adjacent forts. The 18th Mountain Corps, under General Franz Böhmer, was tasked with assaulting the bulk of the Metaxas line at Rupel, while the 30th Corps of General Otto Hartmann had to advance towards the Turkish border and outflank the easternmost forts. Meanwhile, General Georg Stürmer's 40th Panzer Corps was commanded to storm southern Yugoslavia and take the key positions of Monastir and Strumica. Böhmer's 125th Regiment was the first to assault the Metaxas line, while the artillery was still pounding the Greek forts. Bits of the concrete superstructures began to give way under the relentless hammering, but Rupel's defences proved to be surprisingly resilient after the bombardment, and Bokopolos's forces managed to repel the initial German assault. In the east, Hartmann managed to outflank the Metaxas line, and would capture the towns of Xanthi and Komotini a few days later. Rupel, however, was the adamantine obstacle to a general German advance, and Bokopolos ordered that it be held until the last man. In the west, Stürmer sent the 73rd Division to capture Prilep, thus isolating Yugoslavia from its allies, and the 2nd Panzer Division to capture Strumica and outflank the Metaxas line. The panzers encountered little resistance, and managed to occupy Strumica on the same day. In response, Lumbas shielded the town of Kilkis to avoid encirclement. On April 7th, the assaults on Fort Rupel resumed. The Germans were repelled again, but they managed to infiltrate positions around the fort and pinned down where the Greek guns were. To the west, the 2nd Panzer Division enjoyed much more success, as they repelled a Yugoslav counterattack and forced their way across the mountains, overrunning the thinly manned defensive line of Lumbas's forces south of Lake Doiran. Lumbas was forced to retreat, and Kilkis was occupied by the panzers, who continued south towards Salonika. In result, the Metaxas line had been completely cut off from the rest of the Greek defences. Bokopolos continued to resist, but his forces were exhausted. One day later, Salonika fell and Bokopolos was forced to ask for a truce, which List accepted. The Wehrmacht would allow all captured Greek officers to keep their sidearms, and pledged that none of them would be sent to a concentration camp. The battle for Fort Rupel had cost the Germans more than 300 killed against 56 Greeks. But the majority of the Greek defences were gone, and now the only one that could stop the German advance was Wilson. On the Albanian front, the Greeks launched the joint offensive with the Yugoslavians against the Italian forces, aiming to advance into Durazzo and Valona. Initially it went well, but after the fall of Skopje on April 7th, the Yugoslavians were knocked out of the fight. General Gorgios Salakoglu, the commander of the Epirus army, kept advancing and fighting for a few days, but by April 10th the news of the fall of Salonika forced them to stop the offensive and consider retreat. On April 15th, the Greeks started their withdrawal from the Albanian front, and by April 20th they reached Greek soil again. The progress of a 5-month campaign had been undone in just 2 weeks. In Greece, the political and military establishments were struck by a defeatist paralysis. Even Papagos knew that the country was going to be occupied, and that he would be captured with the rest of his army. In Aliakmon, Wilson prepared his forces to hold the line, hoping that the forces in Albania would come to his aid. By April 8th, Prilep had fallen to the 73rd Division, and Stürmer's forces prepared to advance towards Monastir. The 9th Panzer Division defeated the Greeks defending the Monastir Valley, and rallied for an offensive towards Kozani. The objective of the attack was to encircle Salakoglu's forces in Albania and the British at the Aliakmon line, and thus prevent both of them from linking up. At this point, Wilson's forces in Aliakmon were starting an organised withdrawal to a new defensive position on Mount Olympus. Mackay's forces were charged with the defence of the key Klidi Pass, linking the towns of Vevi and Klidi, and had to gain as much time as possible. The 9th, reinforced with the SS Adolf Hitler Regiment, took Vevi on April 11th and launched the attack on Klidi the following day, using the same blitzkrieg strategy that had devastated France and Yugoslavia. Stumme planned to do a three-pronged attack, with Diedrich's SS regiment flanking the Mackay forces, while the bulk of the 9th Division directly assaulted the Klidi Pass with the objective of capturing the road to Kozani. At 8:30 am, the Germans launched a preliminary attack against two high points around the pass. Although the Australian companies offered fierce resistance, by 11 am these positions had been lost to German bayonet charges. The retreat of their comrades caused a concussion in the Allied camp, and soon some of their forces started to retreat, leaving the Klidi Pass defenseless. Only some New Zealand machine gun detachments stood in the way of the German forces, and they would hold the incoming waves by firing over open sights. The heroic tenacity of the New Zealanders was very successful, preventing a quick German breakthrough and giving time for Mackay to organise a withdrawal southwards to Kozani. Meanwhile, at the village of Sotir, a small Australian force under Brigadier George Vassey was placed to rearguard the Allied retreat. By nightfall, Vassey's men were digging in as Brigadier Charrington arrived with his armoured forces to assume command of the delaying actions. In the meantime, a western company of the 9th Division captured the village of Sinon Neron, leaving the Greek 12th and 20th Divisions in a difficult position. The retreat of the Australians had left them unprotected, yet they continued to offer brave resistance against Diedrich's SS regiment. Eventually, the Greek forces managed to withdraw to the Klissura heights, shielding their allies while they retreated. Luckily, the Germans were also delayed by road demolitions executed by the British, preventing them from exploiting the disorganized state of the Allies. By now, most of the Mackay forces had already successfully reached Kozani, in no small part due to these obstacles and the tenacity of Greek forces. The following day, the Australians continued to heroically offer resistance at Sotir. The tank squadron was especially effective in this defence, as its mere presence discouraged the German infantry from attacking. At the same time, Charrington was progressively withdrawing the Allied forces to the second delaying position at Ptolemaidas. By midday, Stumme's forces launched a well-coordinated assault from Sinon Neron, but most of the Allied forces had already managed to escape southwards. Pressing their retreat, the German general sent his panzers in pursuit of the fleeing Australians, but the tank crews were frustrated by the effectiveness of Allied demolitions, so they decided to attempt a flanking maneuver to the west, while the German infantry assaulted the positions at Ptolemaida. With dusk falling, the panzers surprisingly fell on the Allied headquarters. Although Charrington's tanks managed to hold off the German surprise attack, the brigadier was afraid that his forces would be cut off. In the end, the Australians started their final withdrawal southwards, covered by the British tanks. Yet this came at a great cost, as in result Charrington's armoured brigade ceased to exist as a fighting unit, with most of their vehicles damaged beyond repair. The objective, however, had been achieved. Mackay suffered many casualties, but he had gained 2 days' time for the British retreat, although the Greek divisions there didn't withdraw fast enough and soon found themselves trapped at the Klissura Pass. They tried to create a defensive position to stop the German advance, with the 20th Division being heavily pummeled, but eventually managed to retreat to Lake Kastoria. Back in Macedonia, the 30th Corps was tasked with occupying northeastern Greece, with the 50th Division securing Salonika and the 164th moving to occupy the Aegean Islands. This allowed Burma's forces to continue the advance and support Stumme on the offensive. By the morning of April 14th, the spearheads of the 9th Panzer Division reached their objective of Kozani and established a bridgehead over the Alekhmon River, but Wilson's forces had slipped away, and soon Stumme ordered his forces to continue the pursuit. On April 15th, the panzers caught the Greek 12th Division on the Sietista Pass and inflicted heavy losses, while Diedrich's SS forces annihilated the 20th Division at Kastoria. Diedrich then continued to advance south towards Ioannina, aiming to completely trap the Greek army in Albania. By April 19th, the SS regiment had captured Grevina and 1 day later attacked the Katara Pass, defeating the Epirus army and capturing Ioannina. Soon Seleucus realized the hopelessness of the situation and offered to surrender his army. As with the Macedonian forces under Pakopolos, Seleucus' forces were treated with great respect and were allowed to retain their sidearms and go home after the end of the campaign. This, however, knocked out the remaining Greek forces. Wilson was now alone in the task of defending Greece. He created his new defensive line at Mount Olympus while preparing his forces for another withdrawal through Larissa, this time to the pass of Thermopylae. This line extended from the coast at Platamon to the Servia Pass, passing through Olympus. Wilson deployed the 4th and 5th New Zealand Brigades and the 16th Australian Brigade for the defence of this position. From Salonika, the bulk of the 18th Corps captured Veria and Edessa on April 11th and Katerini on April 14th, standing just in front of the Olympus line by the start of the offensive. With the arrival of Stürmer's panzers 1 day later, the attack on Mount Olympus started. The Germans were held off there for the next 3 days by the heroic British forces, who fought them tooth and nail. Worthy of mention is the Battle of the Servia Pass, where the panzers of the 9th Division struggled against a small force of New Zealanders. At dusk on April 14th, the German 11th Infantry Regiment began the attack with the crossing of the Aleakmon River, but their efforts were thwarted thanks to the accurate artillery fire of the 4th New Zealand Brigade. The day ended with the start of the Stuka bombardment of the Allied positions on the pass. The following morning, Stürmer ordered 2 companies to advance forward and silence the troublesome enemy forces that were preventing them from making a river crossing. Yet these forces advanced straight into a trap, as the New Zealanders ambushed them at point-blank range. As the Germans were trapped and running low on ammunition, these companies would soon be destroyed by the strong fire of the New Zealanders. By midday, 2 motorcycle companies crossed the river following their comrades and were pinned down by Allied artillery and snipers. 2 infantry assaults north of Servia would be repelled throughout the rest of the day, and no bridge would be constructed due to the heavy shelling of their positions. The bombardments of the Stuka would also be unsuccessful, as the Allies held strong fortress-like dug-in positions. At the end of the day, the Germans had lost more than 300 men against 2 dead and 6 wounded New Zealanders. Stürmer now realized that dislodging the Allies from the Servia Pass would be more difficult than expected. Thus the German general decided to bypass this position through Diedrich's exploit further west, and the New Zealanders would be left in control of the pass for the next few days. Furthermore, the Allies would enjoy similar success on the Olympus Pass, to the relief of the British and Greek governments. But when the Italian army took back Korce on the Albanian front, Wilson finally feared a total encirclement and ordered the retreat on April 17th, only suffering light casualties. After crossing the Peneios River, the Australian 16th and the New Zealand 21st Battalion under Brigadier Arthur Allen made a last stand at Tempe Gorge, a key point just in front of Larissa. They needed to hold the Germans off until April 19th. The German 6th Division marched across the mountains and emerged at the exit of the Tempe Gorge, only to find the bridges and ferry demolished and the railway track blocked. The tired mountain troops were met by heavy machine gun fire from the south bank of the river. By nightfall, the 1st Panzers crossed the river, but they were bogged down in a swamp while trying to bypass a road demolition. On the morning of April 18th, armoured infantry crossed the river on floats, while the 6th troops worked their way around the New Zealand battalion. The battalion was annihilated, and Allen's forces had to retreat. 1 day later, Burma's forces entered Larissa and took possession of the airfield, where the British had left their supply dump intact. At the same time, the Greek government was shocked when Prime Minister Alexandros Korizis committed suicide. On April 21st, the port of Volos fell to the German advance. All seemed lost for the defenders, and finally Wilson started to prepare for an evacuation to Crete, which started 3 days later. On April 15th, the 40th Panzer Corps were reinforced by the victorious 5th Panzer Division from the invasion of Yugoslavia, arriving in Grevena on April 19th. From there, the panzers advanced southwards via Kelebeka towards Lamia. Meanwhile, the battered 9th Panzer Division was assigned to the reserves. In just 2 days, the 5th reached its objective and linked up with Burma's 18th Corps. But the Germans had lost much time, and Wilson's forces had reformed at a new defensive line at the Thermopylae Pass, the gateway to the Greek capital of Athens. From the port of Piraeus, some British troops were already being evacuated to Crete. The plan was for the forces at the historic Thermopylae to make a last stand and gain as much time as possible for the evacuation of Greece. The defense line consisted of light field fortifications, the construction of which did not seem to have progressed beyond the initial stage. Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division was given the task of defending the coastal pass, while Mackay's 6th Australian Division was to hold the village of Bralos. By April 22nd, a flying column of the 5th Panzer Division, supported by well-camouflaged artillery and single tanks, was attacking the Thermopylae positions that were defended by British infantry. The initial German probing attacks were without success. On the next day, a wide enveloping movement was undertaken by the 6th Division, crossing the difficult terrain west of the British positions. This operation took place simultaneously with another outflanking maneuver performed by a tank-supported motorcycle battalion advancing via the town of Molos. On April 23rd, Wilson ordered a retreat from Thermopylae, and it was decided that the British positions were to be held by 1 brigade each. These brigades, the 19th Australian and 6th New Zealand, were to hold the passes as long as possible, allowing the other units to withdraw to the Peloponnesus. 1 day later, the Germans attacked, meeting fierce resistance and sustaining considerable casualties. Against greater odds, the Allies held out the entire day. With the delaying action accomplished, they retreated in the direction of the evacuation beaches and set up another rearguard at Thebes. The panzer units launching a pursuit along the road made slow progress because of the steep gradient and a large number of difficult hairpin bends. But from Lamia, Burma had sent a motorcycle battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division to cross to the island of Euboea and seize the port of Chalcis. Now he commanded this battalion to outflank the British last stand and capture Athens. The motorcycle troops encountered only slight resistance, and on the morning of April 27th, the first Germans entered Athens. The Athenians had been expecting the Germans for several days, and confined themselves to their homes with their windows shut. The fall of Greece was now an established fact, with the Germans raising the Nazi flag on the Acropolis. At the same time, 2 battalions of the 2nd Parachute Regiment dropped at the Gulf of Corinth in an airborne operation, attempting to trap the British at Athens. By this time, however, most of the British troops were already on the Peloponnesus for their evacuation. The airborne seizure of the Isthmus of Corinth had been coordinated with a drive across western Greece launched on April 25th. Dietrich's SS regiment advanced from Ioannina in a thrust along the western foothills of the Pindus Mountains, via Arta to Messalongion, and crossed over to the Peloponnesus at Patras in an effort to gain access to the isthmus from the west. On April 27th they met with the paratroopers in Corinth and learned of the fall of Athens. In their hasty evacuation, that took place mostly at night, the British used numerous small ports like Nafplio, Kalamata and Monemvasia, and had already managed to evacuate more than 20,000 troops. Diedrich rushed back to Patras to envelop the retreating British forces from the west, while Burma's forces advanced from the east towards Argos. Both forces met at the port of Kalamata on April 29th, capturing some 8,000 British and Yugoslav prisoners and liberating many Italians from Greek camps. The Germans, meanwhile, only lost around 5,000 men in the entire campaign. By April 30th, the last British troops had either escaped or been taken prisoner, and hostilities ceased, thus ending the invasion. The British successfully completed the evacuation of about 50,000 soldiers to Crete, but in their hasty retreat, they lost 11,840 men. The loss of Greece was a tough one for the Allies. The Greeks had inspired the democratic world with their resistance against the Italian invaders, even earning the respect of the unstoppable Germans. And although Greece was divided between the Axis powers, it is hardly the end of our story. In late October 1940, the Kingdom of Greece had been invaded by fascist Italy. The British, having guaranteed their Greek allies against the Italian threat, quickly moved to reinforce the island of Crete with the 14th Infantry Brigade, mainly at Suda Bay. Brigadier Brian Chappell was placed in command of this unit to defend the island. For the British, control of Crete was of the utmost importance, since it gave them an ideal place to maintain their naval and air superiority in the eastern Mediterranean. But as the Greeks managed to repel Mussolini's offensive, Hitler feared that the British could use Crete to prepare a landing on the Balkan coast, or that they could conduct from there aerial bombings on the Romanian oil fields, critically needed for the planned campaign against the Soviet Union. If the Germans wanted to safely launch Operation Barbarossa, they needed to secure Greece and the Cretan island for themselves. In April 1941, Hitler launched Operation Marita, and his forces invaded the Greek mainland. Despite fierce resistance, the Germans managed to occupy the country in just 24 days. But Crete still posed a threat to Hitler's plans, and he needed to quickly decide how to deal with it. Despite the superiority in numbers of the Italian navy, they had been defeated by British Admiral Andrew Cunningham's forces at Taranto and Matapan, and so they couldn't be trusted to launch an amphibious assault on the island. However, the Germans now boasted air superiority in the region, and when General Kurt Student of the 11th Air Corps presented a plan for an airborne invasion of Crete, codenamed Operation Merkur, he managed to convince the Führer on April 25th to issue a directive in favor of this audacious operation. General Alexander Löhr of Luftflotte 4 was placed in overall command of Operation Merkur, but General Student would be assigned to lead the airborne invasion. Student was a very capable and energetic commander, fighting as a pilot in World War I and creating in 1938 the 1st Battalion of Fallschirmjäger, the paratrooper branch of the Luftwaffe. Confident in the success of the operation, Student started using Junkers Ju-87 Stuka bombers to disrupt the sea power of the British fleet and to carry out air raids on British airfields. Meanwhile, he prepared his men for the upcoming offensive. He divided his forces into 10 air transport groups, with a total of approximately 600 troop carriers and 100 gliders. The reliable transport Junkers Ju-52 and the assault glider DFS-230 were the most used among this. The 3-engine Junkers Ju-52 was an ideal machine for parachuting, capable of carrying 13 paratroopers and their equipment. The DFS-230 was a glider with a speed of about 100 to 120 miles per hour that could carry 8 passengers, one of them with the ability to fire a machine gun through a hole on the fabric on the right side. On the sea, Student would be aided by 2 naval convoys carrying equipment and supplies, commanded by Admiral Karl-Georg Schuster. The Luftwaffe's plan was to do an air landing in 3 groups, with a total of 15,000 men, with 7,000 reinforcements coming by sea. Group West, formed by the elite 1st Airborne Assault Regiment, would be commanded by General Eugen Meindl. Colonel Bruno Brauer's Group East would have the 1st Fallschirmjäger Regiment of the 7th Air Division, and Group Center with the rest of the 7th Air Division. Student planned to do the landing in 2 waves, the first in the morning, with Group West landing at the Malmö airfield, and the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment of Group Center near Kenya, and the second wave in the afternoon, with Group East landing at Heraklion, and the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment of Group Center near the airfields of Rethymnon. General Wolfram von Richthofen's 7th Air Corps, composed of 280 bombers, 150 dive bombers, and 180 fighters, was to provide strong air support for all the landings. Student's gliders, meanwhile, would have to protect the paratroop drop, and neutralize ground defenses before landing themselves. Once Chania, Melame, Heraklion and Rethymnon had fallen, the naval convoys would land General Julius Paperingel's battle-hardened 8th Mountain Division to secure Suda Bay, and from there they would move on to occupy the rest of the island through its mountain ranges. Back on Crete, 19,000 men, commanded by General Bernard Freyberg, arrived at the island after a hasty evacuation from mainland Greece. Freyberg was a remarkable and experienced commander, recently seeing action in Greece commanding New Zealand's divisions in their evacuation. When he arrived on Crete, all he wanted to do was return to the Middle East. But as the British realized that the Germans were coming for Crete, Churchill put Freyberg in command of the Cretan forces, thinking that an experienced general like him would be better prepared than Brigadier Chapel. At this point, the British had been largely preparing for an amphibious invasion, with Admiral Cunningham forming 4 task forces to prevent seaborne landings. Force A, commanded by Admiral Henry Rawlings, was placed to the west of Crete to engage with the Italian Navy if it appeared. It was composed of the warships Warspite and Valiant, and 5 destroyers. Captain Henry Rowley's Force B was nearby between Cape Matapan and Sapienza Island, with 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers to assist Force A or C if they needed it. From Leros to the Kassos Strait was Force C, with 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, commanded by Admiral Edward King in defense of Heraklion and Scythia. And with 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers, Admiral Irvine Glennie's Force D was placed west of the Antikythera Channel in defense of Rethymnon. But information gathered by ultra-intelligence alerted the British of the incoming airborne invasion, and Freyberg had to prepare his defences from scratch. He also had to be cautious not to show that they were expecting an airborne invasion, as that would have revealed that they had deciphered the Enigma code. By May 17th, the general had available some 40,000 troops, including British, New Zealanders, Australians and Greeks, although some lacked weapons. Freyberg divided his forces into 4 groups to defend the 4 points where the invaders were going to land. At Heraklion he placed Chapel's 14th Infantry Brigade with some Greek and Australian battalions, with a total garrison of 8,000 men. In the Georgiopolis-Rethymnon sector was Brigadier George Vassey's 19th Australian Infantry Brigade, with some Greek regiments attached, for a total of 7,500 men. At Suda Bay stood the British Marines of General Eric Weston in defence of Chania, accompanied by some Greek and Australian forces with some 8,000 men. And finally, the 2nd New Zealand Division under Brigadier Edward Puttick covered the Malame-Galatas sector just west of Chania with approximately 8,000 more men. Freyberg further assigned the 1st Battalion of the Welch Regiment at the Akrotiri Peninsula and placed east and west of Chania some 16 light tank Mark 6s and 6 obsolescent heavy tanks Matilda Mark II. At dawn on May 20th, Operation Merkur was launched. It started with the 7th Air Corps performing a series of concentrated attacks on the British defensive positions, followed by Student's first wave of gliders and paratroopers. Group West was the first to land, with 3 companies landing near Malame. Then landed 2 companies from Group Center, 1 near Galatas and 1 more at the Akrotiri Peninsula. In response, the low-altitude machine guns and anti-aircraft guns of the defenders fired ceaselessly to keep the paratroopers pinned down. To the south and east of the Malame airfield, as well as on the Akrotiri Peninsula, the Germans were swiftly dealt with and practically wiped out. The paratroopers suffered massive casualties against the British barrage, and General Meindl himself was seriously wounded within an hour of landing. But Group West was initially successful, capturing the high ground overlooking the Malame airfield from the west and driving underground the defenders near Galatas so that some of the gliders could land undetected. By afternoon, the Germans were halted by the strategic Hill 107 at the western edge of Malame, and a dust storm held up the arrival of the second wave of paratroopers. Finally, at 16:15, the rest of Group Center dropped towards Rethymnon, while Group East delayed for an hour their arrival at Heraklion. This delay also caused the drops to be spread out, enabling the defenders to kill many of the paratroopers before they had even reached the ground. Just like in the first wave, the Germans sustained heavy casualties on landing, although they managed to occupy the hills south of Rethymnon. But at Heraklion, Group East had lost 1/3 of their forces and were now on the defensive. Realizing the failure of his plan, Student decided to concentrate his remaining forces on supporting the attack against Maleme. On May 21st, Vassi's forces launched a counterattack against the Germans at Rethymnon, but the paratroopers held firm. Meanwhile, Student sent the devastating Stukas to bombard Maleme, Rethymnon and Heraklion in preparation for a renewed attack. Group East and Center were ordered to hold their ground in a defensive position, while Student dropped 550 paratroopers at Tefrontis to reinforce Group West. At Hill 107, the 22nd New Zealand Battalion under Colonel Leslie Andrew stood as the main unit in defense of Maleme, and he decided to launch an attack on the Germans without support. This assault was very effective, as the paratroopers were only armed with small arms and grenades, and they couldn't resist much longer. But despite the success of his assault, Andrew retreated from Hill 107 at night after his tanks broke down, thinking that he had been overwhelmed. This stroke of luck enabled the Germans to fulfill their main objective. Protected by the glider's fire, the Germans rallied and then seized Hill 107 and the western edge of the airfield. This was the turning point of the battle, as the Germans subsequently managed to take the airfield of Maleme, and they could now continue to land more troops and equipment for the invasion, including a regiment of mountain troops led by General Ringel. With these reinforcements, the Germans quickly gained the upper hand and gained numerical superiority. At night, the first naval landing was attempted, carried out by 20 Kaikis escorted by the Italian torpedo boat Lupo. But Force D managed to repel them, destroying half of the enemy boats. However, this caused Admiral Glennie's forces to suffer an ammunition shortage, and they had to be recalled to Alexandria in the subsequent hours. The following day, a new naval landing attempt was thwarted by Force C at dawn. This convoy of 38 Kaikis, escorted by the Italian destroyer Sagittario, was directed towards Heraklion. The heroic actions of the Sagittario, laying a smokescreen under concentrated fire, managed to save the flotilla and return to Greece unharmed. Furthermore, the British Navy was under unremitting bombardment, losing 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers in the process, and Admiral King ordered Force A to reinforce Force C in the Aegean Sea. This was a mistake, as the 2 forces were now easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Warspite and Valiant were both hit by bombs, while the destroyer Greyhound and the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji were sunk. The naval forces would be reinforced by the 5th Destroyer Flotilla coming from Malta, consisting of 5 destroyers under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten on the Kelly. But these reinforcements too would be assaulted by the Stukas, which succeeded at sinking the destroyers Kashmir and Kelly. Mountbatten and his crew, however, would be saved by the destroyer Kipling, immediately retreating back to Alexandria with his flotilla. Overall, these heavy losses forced the British fleet to vacate the area around Crete and leave the island on May 23rd, consolidating the triumph of the Luftwaffe over the British Navy. Back inland, a new counterattack by Vassi's forces managed to defeat the Germans at the southern hills of Rethymnon. The paratroopers had to retreat to the town of Perivolia, with some of them further retreating to a factory at Stavromenos. Back in Galatas, Group Center launched an assault on Pink Hill. They managed to take it, but then lost it to a counterattack by Captain Michael Forrester and his Greek regiment. Meanwhile, Group East temporarily captured half of Heraklion by afternoon during a daring assault, but Chapel's forces counterattacked and recaptured the western half of the town. The British were resisting tooth and nail, but without Maleme, their efforts would be fruitless. At night, the New Zealanders under Putik launched a counterattack to recapture the vital airfield of Maleme, but they were soundly defeated by Ringel's fresh mountain troops. This ended their aspirations for taking back the now main landing point for the Germans. Over the next few days, the Germans continued to strengthen their forces from Maleme, while Group Centre around Rethymnon and Group East at Heraklion kept resisting the British assaults under heavy pressure. May 23rd started with a fearsome German attack. Group Centre, reinforced and better equipped, captured Galatas and assaulted Pink Hill, expelling the Greeks there. But Putik knew that if the invaders were not hit hard and unexpectedly, they would sweep out the defenders. As such, he sent the Maori regiments under their traditional war cry, the Haka, to take the Germans by surprise. This was highly effective, and Putik managed to liberate Galatas from German control. But the Germans were reinforced by Ringel's mountain troops, and started a new counterattack 2 days later, forcing the Maoris to retreat. With Galatas now in the hands of the Germans, the road to Suda Bay was open. Putik then retreated to form a new defensive line from Kania to Suda, centered at a sunken road called 42nd Street, which ran from Kania to the town of Sikolaria. As the British started reinforcing Heraklion on May 26th, and the situation in the west was stable, Student decided to launch a new wave of drops over Colonel Brower's whereabouts. 4 companies of paratroopers were taken from Maleme on May 28th to reinforce Group East. Furthermore, an Italian regiment of about 3,000 men would make a naval landing at the town of Sitya by midday, which would then continue to advance through the eastern end of the island. On May 27th, Ringel's main offensive was launched. But to their surprise, the New Zealander and Australian forces rallied at 42nd Street and started a bayonet charge. As a result, the Germans were sent packing, suffering losses as they fled. The British had finally won a day of respite, but it wouldn't be enough. Freyberg realized that the Germans were now superior in number and equipment, and without any other choice, ordered an evacuation from the island, starting with Western and Putik's forces at Suda Bay. They would have to traverse a small mountain road across the Lefka Ori, or White Mountains, to the southern bay of Sfakia, where the evacuation fleet would be waiting for them. On May 28th, 2 battalions from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Commando were sent from Alexandria to Suda to cover the retreat southwards. The British troops marched 60 to 70 miles through tough terrain under the threat of a continuous Luftwaffe bombardment. Meanwhile, Ringel's mountain troops occupied Kania and Suda and continued their advance in pursuit of the British retreating forces, while also sending reinforcements to Group Centre around Rethymnon. Joined by the Maoris and the British Marines, and employing the last remaining Matilda tanks, the commandos under Brigadier Bob Laycock would see some fighting from Beretiana down the road, managing to hold off the German offensive. But at the town of Babalikani, Laycock's forces were cut off by the Germans, fighting to their last breath to give the evacuation as much time as possible. Laycock and some of his men were able to escape, but the majority ended up killed or captured. At the end of the day, the British forces would finally arrive safely at Sfakia. At the same time, the Germans at Pavolia were pushed back by Vassi's forces, but as the latter was very low on supplies, he would only hold the town for a short while. When the order of evacuation reached Heraklion and Rethymnon, the British soldiers were astonished. They had been highly successful in their defense and thought themselves to be winning the battle. But they quickly followed their orders and prepared to evacuate. From Heraklion, some 4,000 men of Chappell's brigade were transported by Force B under heavy aerial attack. The reinforced German paratroopers then assaulted the city on May 29th, but couldn't stop the garrison from escaping. The following day, the Greek forces at Rethymnon were evacuated, while the Australians remained to defend the city. Group Centre received ample reinforcements, including several panzers, and in the end, Rethymnon fell when Colonel Ian Campbell, left in command of the Australian forces, was forced to surrender at night. From May 28th to June 1st, Admiral King's Force C would carry out the evacuation of some 6,000 men, suffering losses against the Luftwaffe. Of their 40,000 men, the British managed to rescue almost 18,000 of them, while the rest were left behind on the island, totaling in the end some 23,000 casualties. On June 1st, Ringel's mountain forces captured Sverkia and the remaining 5,000 defenders surrendered. In the east, Brauer's forces managed to link up with the Italians at Iera Petra. This signaled the end of the operation, although the loss of life would continue. Throughout the battle, the Cretan population had aided the British in their struggle against the invaders, fighting with whatever weapons they could gather. Once the island had been occupied, Student ordered the execution of a series of collective punishments against the civilians, with more than 500 inhabitants being massacred. After the war, the German general managed to avoid prosecution for the war crimes he committed. Hitler's airborne gamble had been a success, but it wasn't the success he expected. The Germans had suffered massive casualties, almost 6,000 of them, and lost a significant amount of aircraft. The Führer was so aghast by this that he discounted any future use of airborne troops on such a grand scale. The Fallschirmjäger would then be reformed to act as normal land soldiers in future operations such as Barbarossa. But the Allies, however, would be so impressed by the success of the paratroopers that they rapidly began to build up their own airborne forces, which would be very important later on in the war. The legacy of the battle is that of a huge victory for air forces over a superior naval foe that was also superior in number with his land forces. Thanks to Mindstone for sponsoring this video. Mindstone is a collaborative learning tool designed for anyone who wants to gather the content they love in a place they control. If you sign up for Mindstone before June 30th, you'll become a free founding user for life. We've added all our research for this video to our Mindstone library, and you can access it via the link in the description. Join the conversation, support our channel and this great new platform by signing up via the link in our description today. Our series on modern warfare will continue, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on